So welcome back, everybody. We're now on to Lucy Wyatt doing her talk about approaching chaos, which is her amazing book, which you really should get. And she's going to be discussing some of the aspects from that. Some of you may know Lucy already. She's spoken at Megalithomania and numerous other conferences in Britain and other places. So she's going to be sharing some of her incredible research from a slightly different angle to what we're used to, apparently. So let's see how that goes. All right, so please give a warm welcome to Lucy Wyatt.
Thank you, Hugh, for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to share with you all certain ideas about our past, present and future. What I want to talk about is not just approaching chaos, which I think we are starting to experience in the 21st century as the energies are shifting and we are entering a new age, but also about how we might reconnect with the ancient past. In other words, look backwards in order to go forwards. And as a result, I hope to encourage you to develop a different perspective on civilization. This talk is loosely based on my book, copies of which I have for sale. This is how the modern world is sold to us. Very exciting, streamlined, technological, very electric blue, really quite seductive. There is, however, a disconnect between how we're supposed to see the world and how it actually is. This is more like the reality of streamlined, technological, not really very blue, really rather brown. Our lives are dominated by infrastructure. It begs the question of what is the end that all this means is directing us towards. Is this the purpose of life, sitting in front of screens? And where does all this virtual reality leave our relationship with the beautiful blue planet? In particular, this is how we treat those that are closer to nature, animals who are closer to nature than us, spraying them for germs and bacteria. And if you think that's bad enough, this is how we treat people. And this is more like another kind of reality. I don't know if you can tell what this is. This is basically the vast islands of floating plastic caught up in the ocean gyres. There are about 5 of them according to that map. And it seems to be that the more we pollute the planet, the less we are able to engage with it. We are creating our own vicious circle. We have reached the point we cannot risk interacting with Mother Earth without some chemical or physical intermediary. We cannot trust the fish we eat. We cannot eat fruit and vegetables without washing them first. We can no longer drink directly from streams. We live in constant fear of bacteria and germs. And I don't need to tell you all that this is Fukushima in Japan. Indeed, when we have a natural disaster, we are so poisonous that we make it worse. These are 2 tragic images down the bottom here of a farmer who chose to stay behind in the zone to look after his cows. But the milk is contaminated so that all he can do is milk them so they are comfortable and then dispose of the milk. What his future is or that of his cows is anyone's guess. We could, of course, ignore Japan and just dismiss it as an exception. No tsunamis here in the UK. But our experience of normal life is not much better with cancer rates as high as they are in the West without nuclear incidents. Not surprising then that some people want to turn their backs on civilization and reconnect with some Celtic or Druidic past that is closer to nature. And personally, I have a lot of sympathy for such reactions. I have myself chosen to live deep in the countryside surrounded by 600-year-old oak trees. The photograph on the right is a shot from my own home. I expect I'm not alone in thinking about what kind of disaster would actually destroy civilization as we know it. And there is one such scenario which many of you may be familiar with. It's what the Americans call a low-frequency, high-consequence event, which would be possibly catastrophic for modern civilization. This scenario is what is referred to as a repeat of the 1859 Carrington event. In 2008, the American Academies of Science wrote a report based on what happened in 1859. It was the largest ever recorded geomagnetic storm from the sun. Aurora borealis was seen all over the world, most notably in the Caribbean. They were so bright that in the Rockies, the gold miners there thought it was morning and started making breakfast. And telegraph systems all over Europe and North America failed, caught fire. But then all they had then was telegraph lines. They didn't have what we have now. So this report that the American Academies of Science in 2008 established that if it happened today, this is what would happen. This kind of damage, $1 to $2 trillion dollars in damages. And just imagine, no electricity for 4 to 10 years. They compare it with Hurricane Katrina in terms of the scale of damage. And this is a bit of what the report says. The loss of power after backup supplies are exhausted could affect water, communication, banking and finance, about every critical infrastructure, including government services, as if we care. Loss of these systems for a significant period of time, even in one region of the country, would affect the entire nation and have international impacts. For example, financial institutions could be shut down, freight transportation stopped, communications interrupted. The concept of interdependencies is evident in the unavailability of water due to long-term outage of electric power. I mean, basically, no transport, no food. And that is chaos approaching with very little warning, 1 or 2 days at the most. And even with the warnings, there's still the risk that the grid would be vulnerable because the warning wasn't taken seriously enough. After all, the grid operators want to avoid the massive costs of overreacting to false alarms and shutting the grid down unnecessarily every time there's the slightest worry. But at the point at which the grid collapses, so would civilization in the West. So what are the alternatives? Well, I'm sure many of us would go into survival mode with our bug-out bags and head for the hills. And I put up here 2 photographs of the guys who you're probably very familiar with, Bear Grylls and Ray Mears, my heroes. And the woman in the middle, some of you may know, my cousin Anna Richardson, who is a hedgerow foraging expert. But we might also realise at this point our hunter-gatherer skills are no longer quite as innate in most of us as we might like to think. And at that point, we might reconsider our attitude towards civilization. It is my belief that we have been misled about civilization and that we do not have to turn our backs on it, and that the hunter-gatherer option is not necessarily the only one, not least as there are not enough hedgerows for us all to survive on. And I want to emphasise that when I talk about civilization, what I'm talking about is life as lived in cities. And in having another look at ancient civilization, it is possible that we might discover useful information about how to survive. Now, when we talk about civilization, this is where most people started, about 600-700 BC, Greeks and Romans, and we credit them with everything, civilizing influences, sanitation, legal structures, medicine, geometry, philosophy, all the rest of it. And because we've inherited their languages, these ancient peoples are our way into the past. They are our portal into the past. It's through them in the West that we largely know as much as we do about how people lived and thought over 2,000 years ago. Now, I would argue that one reason why we face such problems today of environmental degradation is because too many of us continue to think like Romans. We continue to think that if we justify, the end justifies the means. In other words, we believe that the destruction caused by the airport runway is justified because of the economic prosperity that it brings. And that is no different in logic from a society in which every 10th soldier can be killed in order to improve military discipline, which is after all the true meaning of decimation, as was the case in ancient Rome. Now, before anybody gets really overly sentimental about Celts being different, it's important to realise that Celts came from the same Indo-European tribal stock as Romans, and are no more indigenous to Britain than Romans were. They just arrived earlier. They didn't build Stonehenge. This list here shows you all the links between the Indo-European tribes, and there's this idea that certain of us lived together over 5,000 years ago, the ones that speak these languages, and this is a time frame that relates to the Bronze Age civilizers. What's important to note is that although we're called Indo-Europeans, we didn't live in either Europe or India. I actually think that the original homeland of the Indo-Europeans was north of the Black Sea in what's called the Pontic Caspian. And how this connection was discovered was through the realization in the 19th century that Indian Sanskrit, although written in a different alphabet, has the same language roots as other European languages like French and Latin. And to have these same roots must have meant we lived together. Otherwise, you've got the Monty Python-esque thing of Celts travelling thousands of miles to let the Indians know that a word has changed, X is now Y. Even so, we still persist in thinking that Greeks invented everything, and we only become aware of ancient Greeks and Romans in the later period of the Iron Age. The reason why the Greeks and Romans appear differently to us, appear civilized, is because in the case of Romans, they took over Rome from the Etruscans, and the Etruscans were the original civilized people, and the Greeks learnt what they knew about civilization from the Egyptians. But because of these confusions over origins, we fail to realize that Greeks and Romans were not the beginning of civilization, but were probably the beginning of the end of civilization, and that before them, there were ancient people who had an entirely different way of thinking about cities, a more holistic one which knew that everything is interconnected and that how we do something is as important as why. The Romans in particular form a barrier to our access to this ancient past because they had an incomplete understanding of these people, the Egyptians, in spite of living with them for several hundreds of years. We have been encouraged to dismiss Egyptians as backward, pagan, primitive peoples burying pharaohs in enormous pyramids, worshipping animals, not civilized. And this prejudice against Egyptians has blocked us from discovering fascinating and useful information about our ancient past. They were among the most important of those who had the holistic philosophy, but they were not the only ones. And it is insight into that ancient past that I briefly want to explore with you, because I think it has much that it could help us with us in the future. Before discussing aspects of Egypt, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that Egyptian civilization itself was based on principles derived from ancient archetypes which predate Egypt as we know it. Evidence for this archetype first appeared with the earliest cities several thousands of years before Egypt. Now, the first thing to say is that we've been told that cities came out of a farming experiment, but I fear this is the wrong story. There was no farming experiment. This idea that agricultural surplus stimulated the growth of settled communities is no more than plausible speculation, which is not evidence-based. Indeed, the evidence suggests that changes in agriculture happened because of cities and not the other way around. They were more than mere exchanges of food surpluses. Indeed, the first evidence of a city was a marketplace, not a marketplace, was a shrine. Archaeologist Jacquetta Hawkes notes that the existence of the temple and its priestly caste is what distinguishes a city from being a mere trading point. They were artificial constructs in the landscape using scientific and technical knowledge. They were deliberate interference with nature for the convenience of citizens. And they reflected concepts of order, organisation, straightness, justice, balance, measurement and accuracy. All this is long before Greeks and Romans. The legends indicate peaceful lawgivers, gods and goddesses who taught the skills for civilization, which suggests that this different way of living did not evolve. It did not slowly develop, it arrived. This is a typical description from the Hermetica, which relates to Egypt, but similar legends exist elsewhere. Of our great father Osiris, great goddess Isis, they brought humanity divine religion and established the rites of worship in correspondence to the sacred powers of the heavens. They consecrated temples and gave the gifts of food and shelter. Having learnt Atum's secret laws, this is the key point, they became lawgivers to humankind and so filled the world with justice. They devised the initiation and training of the prophet priests so that through philosophy they might nurture men's souls and cure sickness of the body with the healing arts. And where these principles first appeared are in the earliest cities in Mesopotamia over 6,000 years ago, long before Egypt, before the Bronze Age. At Eridu, there is evidence of 17 previous temples, under the one dating from 2000 BC, with the earliest possibly dating to 5000 BC or before. And Uruk, in 3600 BC, was a great city with over 10,000 people, and it's typical of this ancient archetype, highly organised, with urban layout, its architecture, its pictographic script and its cylinder seals. Civilization as we know it only appears with the spread of the archetype following a great global catastrophe in 3100 BC. Nobody seems to know quite the cause of this catastrophe. It could have been a comet which had caused the earth to wobble, rivers to shift. It could have been when the Great Flood happened. It could have been Atlantis blowing up, who knows. But it was after that there were massive migrations everywhere as people went in search of new homelands. It's after that point that the Indo-Europeans also split up and went in search of their new homelands. And here you can see from the map, civilization spread to the Indus Valley over in India, to Egypt, to Canaan, which is the modern Lebanon with the Phoenicians, and to Minoan Crete. The same archetype appears later in South America, not to mention China. I now want to explore the basis for these civilizations in more depth, and what I'm going to do is discuss the totality of the archetype. It's an archetype which exists for all times in all places, and the best way to describe it is with the use of a colour wheel. Here you've got everything: animals, government, trade, cooked food, and this is what I think distinguishes cities from hunter-gathering societies. Now we entirely take for granted the usefulness and docility of domestic animals, and it's difficult for us to envisage a time when this was not so. But wherever in the world that civilization appeared, the package relating to domesticated animals always had the same elements: animals that could transport, that could provide milk, and could provide wool. Before that, only limited form of proto-farming existed, involving domesticated cereals and the penning up of wild animals for meat and hides. Had Neolithic man wanted to try farming along the more familiar lines of today, he would not have been able to do so, because the prehistoric forms of animals were not sufficiently modified. The early sheep-goat type animal, for example, did not even have a woolly coat. It had a coat like a deer. So before this point, it wasn't possible. And this change is what the archaeologists call the secondary products revolution. And it's after this point, in around 5000 BC, that you, of course, use milk from a cow for milk and for butter and cheese. Butter and cheese being being the secondary products. You could plough, and all the kinds of farming that we now take for granted. And not only did animals change shape, as prehistorian Steve Mitham points out, all animal species become reduced in size when the domesticated variants arise, but they also became conveniently and usefully docile. Anyone who claims that farm animals evolved out of tamed wild ones has never worked with animals, even modern ones, and I live on a farm and I have everything on there that can kill you. A cow, a bull, a horse. They are capable of doing that, and they demand enormous respect. So I just don't buy into the thing that this kind of docility could be bred into them over generations. After all, Neolithic man was penning these things up for thousands of years, and how come that change only coincided with cities arriving? Our zoos are still full of wild animals. The wolves haven't evolved into dogs. And if you breed something with something else, you have to breed it with something different to itself to achieve a change in outcome. If you take the example of the onager, which is this thing up at the top, the precursor of the donkey, Timothy Potts, writing on behalf of the Oxford University Committee on Archaeology, he explains that it had been thought that the onagers were the domestic equids of the Sumerians, the Mesopotamians. And then he states that more recent investigations suggest that they cannot be fully domesticated. So they were hunted for meat and hides and captured in order to be kept in a semi-wild state for crossbreeding with domestic equids, which begs the question, well, where do the domestic equids come from? There is, of course, the usual chance mutant gene argument, and we are given the impression that around the time of these early experiments, Stone Age man was able to spot a genetic variation in the wild herds he followed, and capable of realizing that a particular auroch down here, which is the precursor of the cow, was carrying the mutant gene that would make a useful cow. But while we would know what would make a useful cow, how would he have the benefit of hindsight? And how suspicious that the outcome was always so convenient, so useful, and coincided with cities. The horse is another example of an animal with a complex relationship since the domestication of the tarpan, which is down there, from the 5th millennium BC in the Ukraine. Before that, it was only useful for meat and hides, and after it was domesticated and changed into a horse, it could be used for lots of things, including an instrument of political philosophy, part of the war machine, which leads me into the next thing, which is government. If the earliest cities had grown out of marketplaces, then they would have developed in a random, organic fashion. But as tell, in terms of urban design, there were three basic patterns: quartering, gridiron, and circular. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which dates from the 3rd millennium BC, refers to the division of Uruk into different quarters. In South America, Tenochtitlan, the original Mexico City, was divided into 4 districts. Other cities like Akhetaten in Egypt and Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley followed more of a gridiron pattern. The Phoenician city of Byblos on the Lebanese coast had streets running in a concentric pattern around its temple. And then the surveying and setting out of buildings for the ancient Egyptians was considered so important that they allocated that role to Sefet or Sheshet. You can see her down here on the left, the mistress of measure. She was the female counterpart of the god Thoth. The 7-pointed star on her head is considered to represent an ancient astronomical sighting device. The corners of new temples would be marked out at night using alignment on astronomical points, and she always accompanied the foundation ceremonies of temples, carrying the measuring cord, a knotted rope that is divided into segments of the sacred cube. Fundamental to ancient architecture was sacred geometry, which I have a picture of on the far over there. The square roots of whole numbers and other irrational ratio familiar to us in the West as the golden section, long before Fibonacci, the Tuscan mathematician who lived about 1200 AD. In fact, it was as much part of ancient knowledge as pi, the irrational ratio that we associate with Pythagoras. And the phenomenon of combining pi and phi is termed gnomic expansion, and it's the geometric principle consistently found in the architecture of the Egyptian temple. Whatever they built, straightness was a key characteristic, regardless of the size of the individual blocks, which could weigh several tons, whether it's bricks or stones or whatever. And the use of the plumb bob, which I put a little thing there, the epic was essential to this. The Epic of Gilgamesh makes specific reference to the great wall surrounding the city of Uruk as being straight as an architect's string. And you can find examples of this plumb bob in museums in Luxor and in Delhi, where the Indus Valley stuff is. Thus, extraordinary engineering and surveying feats, such as the Phoenician canals, built in the 9th century, were precise to the point of ignoring physical objects. Water was a very key thing, and temples often had sacred lakes. Here's a picture of the one up in Mohenjo-Daro, useful in times of drought. With effective water management, cities can sustain life in harsh environments, and this is an artificial pool nearly 40 foot long, waterproof with bitumen. stone reservoirs can be found in many Egyptian temples, and they organised water to bring it fresh in by aqueduct, often using two, one for consumption and one for cleaning. So drainage and sewage was very much a key part of all this, and it is a characteristic of being a civilised city. Without it, large numbers of people cannot happily live in confined spaces. In the Indus Valley, the urban drainage system has been described as unparalleled in pre-classical times. Every house had a bathroom and privy. And I'll return later to the role of the king. But part of his responsibility was to ensure the rule of law and dispensing justice. Large numbers of people are also more likely to coexist peacefully if they not only share sanitation, but also a common legal framework. Fundamental for a civilized society is the law of contract, trade and justice. Interestingly, share this symbol of a pair of weighing scales. The main difference between civilized trade and other forms of acquisition is one of mutual agreements. Trade is legally contracted exchange of goods rather than the chaotic seizing of booty as a consequence of warfare, banditry or piracy. I think modern day Russians still have a bit of a problem with that one. The Phoenicians, for example, used their temple of Melkart in Cadiz in southern Spain as a bank where traders could check the quality of merchandise, exchange equivalencies and weights under the protection of the god. There have been amazing trade routes over the millennia, perhaps the most famous being the Silk Route, which goes, as you know, from Far East to the Middle East, but that's much later. The Silk Route, however, was typical of civilized trade in that it involved the exchange of goods using networks of agents, and there is older examples of such networks dating to from the Bronze Age. In 1933, French archaeologists found evidence of such networks when they excavated a royal palace from this point in the middle of the Euphrates at Mari. It was a huge palace. You can see a scale model of it in the Louvre in Paris. It's got about 300 rooms. And in its ruins, they discovered documents relating to the 18th century BC, referring to Tin being for an agent, a man from Kaptara. Kaptara was the ancient name for Crete, and this man was resident at Ugarit, a Phoenician city on the coast of Lebanon. So you can see tin was being taken possibly from Afghanistan, which is quite a long way to the east, taken to Mari before being sent on to Phoenician trading points. This was all organised a very long time ago. As early as the 4th millennium BC, we can see long trade routes with Mesopotamia, having links with Syria, southern Turkey and western Iran. Trade has been the stimulation for the development of cuisine, as it's partly due to trade that the art of cooking could really develop. The great cuisines of the world start to appear after this point. The ancient Egyptians were not alone in importing food products, and they brought them from around the Mediterranean further south in Ethiopia. Cities were also able to produce cooked food on a significant scale, using more organised methods than hunter-gatherer societies. This photograph is from the excavations of the pyramid workers in dwellings in Egypt. But cities can only survive if they can rely on a good supply of fresh produce, which means a highly productive countryside. Even though cereals had already been domesticated by this point, there weren't necessarily the big-scale irrigation schemes that we then find in later Mesopotamia. And I should point out that what makes the difference between a wild and a domesticated cereal, I've got this little picture of barley head here, is the difference of a single gene. In the wild, the seed head is brittle, and it scatters in the wind when it's ripe. The domestic version waits to be picked. Hallmark of civilization, convenience. And of course, you've got the difference in skill levels between hunter-gatherers and civilized farmers are enormous. You can't take farming for granted. Starvation is too risky. And critical to success is water. Too much, everything rots. Too little, everything withers. We've got huge droughts on at the moment. We know what a problem it is. With the knowledge of irrigation, you can overcome such obstacles. And from the 5th millennium onwards, there's evidence in Mesopotamia of terraces, canals and reservoirs. In Egypt, they use the Nile, but even so, there is evidence of an ancient dam near the modern Aswan Dam in the south of the country, and it has been suggested that the Lake of Muares in Egypt was created as a reservoir for the Nile, 450 miles in circumference, 350 feet deep, complete with floodgates, locks and dams for irrigation. And static production, of course, is highly dependent on the weather, and it's to the priestly caste that the farmer looked for help with interpreting weather patterns. Not only were temples physically located within cities, but priests and priestesses were involved in every aspect of civilization. The temple held all parts in balance, and it's through the medium of the temple that the rest of society had access to knowledge. They were the link between the metaphysical and the physical, the abstract and the practical, and they were responsible for interpreting the divine plan and for the fundamental harmony, so all could live in Mart. Mart being this Egyptian concept of of truth and balance. Above all, they had this relationship with the spirit world. They understood the soul, the psyche, and its role in reincarnation and immortality. They knew that there was a dynamic dialogue of concept of cosmic sympathy, the Hermetic dictum, as above, so below. It wasn't fatalistic. Fate was negotiable with the gods, because they believed that through manipulation of the higher metaphysical plane, human beings could affect change in the lower world and interfere with the natural order to create civilization. And they regarded it as their responsibility to pass their knowledge on and to educate the young and keep written records. Thus, they were responsible for communication and forms of travel and education. Part of what they taught was geometry, which after all means earth measurement. They knew that the earth was round, and we have had to rediscover that fact. The centres of ancient sites themselves had great symbolic importance. And I put up this picture down here. It's myself and my father in Delphi by the omphalos, these navel stones. And the civilizers apply the same principles of accurate measurement and straightness to the setting out of routes to roads as to other aspects of the model. In this picture of the Nazca lines here, we tend to think of Romans when we think of straight roads, but even Romans built on top of existing straight Celtic ones. And the idea is independent of the Romans. Peruvian roads were old even by the time of the Incas and were well built, with the most dramatic example being the ones of the Nazca lines. The accuracy of the Nazca lines is so impressive. The National Geographic Society survey in 1968 found that they were so straight that the deviation was less than 4 yards in a mile. And then we have here the Egyptian god in his form of Hermes or Mercury, who symbolizes travel. Piles of stones today are still called herms and found along ancient ways. The Egyptian god Thoth is also linked with education, that he was credited with the invention that helped promote civilization, namely writing. The ability to read and write continues to be a characteristic that we regard as distinguishing civilized society from a primitive one. And through careful and disciplined process of initiation, priests passed on their knowledge of the spiritual mundane based on more than written records. The art of the memory was very, very important to them, to a select few. Organised formal teaching and study were an essential part of the thing. In Egypt, the idea of education was well established, with temples having specific areas called House of Life, with departments dedicated to medicine, astronomy, mathematics and law. And particular temples specialised, such as the one at Komombo, which was particularly associated with. And then we come to the last segment of this whole circle, the white. And Thoth, as Mercury or Hermes, is linked also with this. His double Caduceus is today still a symbol of medicine. And with civilization came a sophisticated approach to medical treatment. The basic instruments they used, you can see engravings of these at Temple of Komombo, have remained unchanged for thousands of years. And at this point, medicine became more organized and systematized, using repertories that recorded specific drugs. The Ebers Papyrus, for example, the oldest known medical text thought to date from 1500 BC, is 68 feet long and itemizes 811 prescriptions. And priests, through their relationship with the divine, could heal the mind, the psyche, as well as the body with food and medicine. In ancient times, there was no split, as there is today, between the physical and mental illness. It was considered essential to involve the psyche in the healing of the body. There were Egyptian priests called Senu priests in Egyptian temples, who specialized in detailed knowledge of the spiritual origin of illness, and which constituted much of the physician priest's approach to treatment. The much later Greek god Asclepius, I've got a picture of him now on the right, was believed to consider diet so important to the treatment of illness. If you go to Epidavros today, what you mostly see is the great big amazing theatre, but actually in the ancient past, around the 4th century BC, it was actually better known as a place where people came to be treated with special dietary treatments by the god Asclepius. So the change from diet of hunter-gatherer to more sophisticated processed food of the city dweller has, however, been a mixed blessing, as there's been an increase in disease and decay as a result of making the change. And it could be said that the domestication of animals resulted in the transmission of infectious diseases due to the ability of bacteria to make the transition from animals to people, e.g. diphtheria from milk. Even today, chickens are blamed for epidemics of human influenza. So food is both part of the problem and part of the solution. And then there are these really interesting relationships across the wheel, all forms of communication, trade, travel, education, the individual body cared for with food and cooking and medicine, agriculture's domestication of animals and organised arable production, and of most interest to us today, power, political power, administration, justice, architecture, infrastructure, and religious power. the defined roles of the priesthood, the really important relationship between priest and king, the Melchizedek. Melchizedek, Melch meaning king and Zedek meaning priest. The shamanic part, which had access to secret knowledge. And I'm not unique in believing today that they had secret techniques which we have yet to discover, or that they were more advanced than we give them credit for. For some of us, the remains of Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and the Americas are seen as so much exotic archaeology with little direct relevance to us, but for others that isn't the case. In particular, it's this ability to be scientific today is what we think of makes us different from the past, and what we consider to be primitive societies. I mean, yes, I've yet to hear a plausible explanation of how the ancients cut and moved their massive stones, the megaliths, the granite in the king's chamber, blocks of 50 tons moved 500 miles from Aswan. The thousands of slaves argument doesn't work for me. I cannot help feeling that these techniques involve vibration, frequencies at a profound level, and the construction of the Great Pyramid itself reveals much which confirms my feeling. For example, the internal construction of the king's chamber has hidden beams above it with chunks missing from them, and the granite walls are not tied into the ceiling. A plausible explanation for all of this is that the purpose of the chamber was to create an electrical field using vibration. The quartz in the granite has a piezoelectric properties, and the reason for not tying the walls into the ceiling is so that they could vibrate freely, and the explanation for the chunks taken out of the beams was so that they could be used for tuning the resonances. Many of you are probably familiar with the work of Chris Dunn, Giza as Power Plant. It's a very fascinating book. And I'm not suggesting that Chris Dunn is wrong about the purpose of the pyramid, but I think it's more than likely it had many different functions. I think he just overlooks the importance of the metaphysical ritual. And I think that was the primary function of the pyramid, and all pyramids everywhere. After all, generating power for what? They didn't have toasters and the need for massive amounts of electricity as we do. But resonance, vibration, and electromagnetic fields, these I think did play a part. For one thing, the Egyptians themselves acknowledged the importance of sound to their culture. They had a concept of Jed that, according to Rosemary Clark, was the divine sound which set all forms in motion. Jed was a cosmic vibration animating matter, bringing it to life. She describes it describing all living things possessing a distinct frequency derived from the cosmic ambience which existed at their birth or inception. The god Thoth, whose name can also be spelt Jehuti, I put the C on the far right there, was the originator of sound, or the vibration which set all matter into motion in primeval time. She describes the principle of the Jed as being like a high science practiced in temples with chant accompanied by sacred instruments. And knowledge of these frequencies enabled the temple mages to invite sacred forces into the sanctuary. The Jed was a fundamental resonance in whatever form that affects living matter, music, chanting, or even speech. Like the Bible, Egyptian texts also refer to the importance of the word in the creation of the world. The first discourse of the Hermetica speaks of the chaotic dark waters of potentiality on which Atum's word fell, calming them and making them pregnant with full forms. And it is interesting to compare this view, this Egyptian view, with more modern experiments to do with cymatics, which show that specific sounds produce specific shapes in nature, such as the honeycomb, snowflake, starfish, and zebra stripes. And furthermore, are there strange connections between ancient magic and quantum physics? And was this what was meant by the Hermetic dictum of as above, so below? But how could something as scientific as quantum physics have any connection with something as unscientific as magic? What we have to realise is that there was no distinction in the ancient mind between science, religion, and magic. Much of what the ancient priesthood knew was what we call science and what they call magic. And although the ancients had scientific knowledge, they were not scientific. They had no notion of objectivity, of being outside knowledge. For the ancients, the human being was fundamental to the process of obtaining knowledge. Who was making the inquiry was as important as the question being asked. So what are the connections with quantum physics? Well, for a start, quantum physics does not exactly fit the usual definition of scientific, even if it is an entirely new phenomenon. According to Niels Bohr in 1927, it's based on uncertainty, complementarity, probability, disturbance of the system being observed by the observer. Froelich also stated that one of the qualities of uncertainty was the phenomenon of non-locality. In other words, a particle could appear in two places at once, and it is never entirely clear where it is. In addition, they could never be sure which aspect of the photon or electron applied, the wave or the particle, giving rise not only just to non-locality principles, but also uncertainty principles. And according to uncertainty principles, physicists could measure either the precise location of the particle or they could measure its momentum, but they could not measure both. So it's no longer possible in quantum physics to maintain objectivity and separate the role of the observer from the observed, the process of observing it. As Heisenberg himself said, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. And discoveries to do with quantum physics led physicists to question the nature of nature itself, and this has led to profound reassessment of the meaning of material substances that we take for granted. In terms of the classical physics of Newton, there was an assumption that the universe consisted of solid objects surrounded by empty space upon which some force like gravity may or may not have exerted pressure. But what quantum physics has done has to go even beyond Einstein's E equals mc squared. And by the way, that's not a mistake I've written down there, it's deliberate, because physicists have now realised that E equals mc squared does not mean that energy converts into mass, but that mass and energy are essentially the same. Puthoff and colleagues take the view that there is no such thing as mass, only electric charge and energy, which together create the illusion of mass. So it's better, E equals mc squared is better understood as a statement about how much energy is required to give the appearance of a certain amount of mass. In other words, a solid object only gives the appearance of being solid. In fact, at subatomic level, it's full of electrical charges that operate at particular frequencies, interacting with the background electromagnetic field, the zero-point frequency, that's the ZPF, in terms of either repulsing or attracting inertial gravity. As physicist Fritjof Capra, who wrote a really beautiful book that I really recommend to anybody called The Tao of T-A-O of Physics, he poetically describes it at subatomic level, including mass, dynamic pattern of energy, probability patterns, interconnections with an inseparable cosmic web, an endless cosmic dance, which is why I put up this picture of Sheba. And these descriptions almost exactly parallel historian Brian Copenhaver's definition of hermeticism, which is what we're talking about in terms of ancient Egypt. He describes the hermetic cosmos as an organic unity whose parts affect one another as participants in the same life. So what's the connection with magic? Well, first is the issue of semantics. Magic does not mean the tricks of the illusionist, but the principle of attraction, as in the drawing down of a cosmic force. Magic in this sense is hermeticism. It concerns the power of attraction. In ancient times, magic was serious. The Egyptians had particular notions of different levels of magic. Magical tricks were the lowest form of magic. That's Gautier, which is down here on the right. With Gautier, the divine force animates an object through imprinting. And then there was magia. The presence of the gods or divine force was experienced only through some material object or medium. And finally, the highest level, theurgy, was a form of magic where the gods were present to a person who might be awake, dreaming, or in an ecstatic state. In Egyptian temples, an important role belonged to the magician or master, the Ur-Heko, which is our good picture here. He's showing, holding these two snakes. He was known as the Lord of Oracles and Revelations, and he who predicts what will happen. And his primary function was the transmission of Heka from the sanctuary to the other priests, the royal house, and in the healing temple to those who were deprived of it through illness. And the Heka is a word from which we get hex, which to us is a curse. But for them it was neutral, it was neither black nor white, it was a mystical force. And in spite of the role of the Heka being having this title, he who predicts, there was not necessarily any sense of fatalism in his engagement with the divine plan. Instead, there was an idea of dynamic dialogue, as I referred to earlier, between the magician, magus or priest, and the spirit world. As above, so below, could be reversed if one were initiated in the techniques and knew how to operate sympathetic magic, the principle of correspondences, that like attracts like. Thus the Ur-Heko could effect change by magical manipulation of one substance that corresponded with another. And how the ancients knew these techniques, I would argue, was through shamanism. And in particular, the chief shaman in Egyptian society was someone we usually refer to as pharaoh. His life mission was to be initiated into secret shamanic rituals, divine rite, R-I-T-E, not divine rite, R-I-G-H-T. Indeed, his title is a Greek corruption of the words per-ur, which actually are the name of the place where the pharaoh's initiation happened, which might have been here at Nekhen, or Hierakonpolis, which is its Greek name in Egypt. Possibly its mysterious fort, which has no defensive purposes. And what the pharaoh prepared for here was a highly important festival which only happened every 40 years and is also referred to as the pharaoh's jubilee, which they call the Hebsed festival, and it incorporated the Osirian rites, the reenactment of the death of god Osiris and his revival at the hands of his wife Isis. This is a typical place, Saqqara, And it took place in a purpose-built courtyard, especially next to a specially constructed pyramid. And these courtyards and pyramids occur all over Egypt. And there's a view that the Great Pyramid at Giza has some carvings which look like they link to the Hebsed festival. In this festival, there were public aspects and secret aspects. Citizens came from all over Egypt to it, and the purpose was to rededicate the country to civilization. In the public aspects, the pharaoh wore a special bull kilt and had to run around his courtyard, which is the bit at the bottom. He also participated in a ritual meal called the hetep. And after this meal, he disappeared into the secret part of the festival, which took place inside the pyramid. Now, the Egyptian word for pyramid is mur, M-R, which has the idea of instrument for ascending, because what the pharaoh was doing was entering the realm of Sokar. Now, Sokar is interesting because of what he represents. He had a more complicated association with death than just being dead. You have to remember at this point the pharaoh is alive, very much alive. Now, Sokar was part of a triple manifestation of the gods Ptah, Sokar, Osiris. And these gods represented the triple powers of animation, incarnation, and restoration, and were thus essential to Egyptian ideas of the cycles of life and death in terms of the soul being immortal and reincarnated in a living body. Writer Rosemary Clark describes Sokar as representing the latent spiritual principle within all living things, the spirit embedded in the deepest regions of matter that await arousal, a description that implies the beginning of life rather than the end of it. By way of reinforcing the idea of vibration in an electrical field, when the pharaoh entered this part of the pyramid, entered the realm of Sokar, he lay on a special bed, his Hebsed festival bed, or he lay in a sarcophagus of alabaster or granite. And now the Hebsed festival bed is made of gold leaf, and you can still see Tutankhamun's Hebsed festival bed in the museum in Cairo, gold being a good conductor of electricity. And before that, he put on a Keni garment over his chest. And he participated in the Wapawet opening of the mouth ceremony. Now, in using the Keni garment, which the pharaoh describes as the embrace of Osiris, was the point of that to protect the pharaoh's heart from the electrical field? And was the opening of the mouth ceremony done to stop him from swallowing his tongue during a trance? And what confirms my suspicions that this was all part of a shamanic ritual are the pyramid or coffin texts. These texts were discovered in the 19th century by Flinders Petrie, the Victorian archaeologist. Again, it's our cultural problem that we think of them as a description of the journey of the pharaoh's soul after death. Because anything that talks about soul in the 19th century, we thought it assumed you were dead. But actually, it's more likely they talk about the journey of the pharaoh's soul in life. And in fact, it was a shamanic journey that he was going on. Dr. Jeremy Nagler has written a book, an Oxford academic, has written a book on this, and he actually writes down what all the different texts are that give this emphasis. I mean, these texts frequently refer to the pharaoh taking on the form of a bird, flying up, or climbing a ladder. Chapter 20 of the Book of the Dead, for instance, talks of the pharaoh rising into the sky like a mighty hawk. The antechamber texts in the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara refer to a stairway to the sky, which is set up for me, that I may ascend on it to the sky, and I ascend on the smoke of the great sensing. I fly up as a bird. Elsewhere, the same texts refer to the pharaoh flying up in the form of a falcon to the imperishable northern stars. An important point which I shall now explain. The point is that all these references are common in modern day shamanic rituals. Now, this thing about the imperishable northern stars is, in my view, this is the true meaning of alchemy. The usual source for alchemy, the chem bit, what people normally say, is it's normally to do with the Black Lands, Egypt being the Black Lands. But that doesn't really make any sense. And what makes more sense to me is that what alchemy actually means is the journey to the fixed stars, the imperishable northern stars, the Kemi. And that what the pharaoh was actually doing was astral planing. Now, if we talk about alchemy, this is what people normally kind of talk about and look at and think about. But was it something more than this? Maybe alchemy wasn't just about changing metal into gold or even spiritual transformation, but the purification of gold to achieve an even purer gold and then use that gold for particular ritual purposes. There are several methods for achieving purification, and one of them is to expose gold to a high electrical charge to remove impurities. Mundi Sadhu, writing a fundamental work on the tarot in the late 1950s, alludes to the role of electricity in his summary of typical alchemical process, and he explains in detail the stages that an alchemist might follow to create the philosopher's stone. The first phase is the preparation of the universal solvent, or mercury, using a mineral called magnesia of sages, which he says has an electrical charge. The second phase is of the operation produces the powder, dazzling white in colour after slow heating in the athanol, the alchemist's oven. And the philosopher's stone is a powder. Some of you may be aware of the writings of Lawrence Gardner, who writes about monatomic gold and the electrical process of purifying gold, which produces a white powder with levitational properties. And not only does the original powder weigh less than the original metal, but it's capable of transferring that to others. A slight kind of breaking all this from Egypt. I just leave you with this thought. Is it any coincidence that the father of science, Sir Isaac Newton, the man credited with discovering gravity, was a major alchemist, in secret, because it held a capital offence. Anyway, just leave that thought with you. So the circumstantial evidence that confirms my view that the Egyptians were practicing alchemy are the links between the solar bread, the substance consumed in the pharaoh's ritual meal, the hetet, and the cow goddess Hathor. It's the man holding the solar bread here. If the Hebsed festival was a shamanic experience, was the hetet meal the means by which he brought on this trance? And a significant element was the solar bread. And one pyramid text describes the solar bread as an enigmatic food spell, utterance for the offering bread to fly up. The reason we are now aware of the true purpose of the solar bread is that the Greeks, through whom we know as much as we do, the reason that we're not aware of it is because the Greeks got confused. And what they confused was a process with an outcome, because I don't think they ever actually got to see the astral planing part. I think they only got to see the preparation of the gold bit, which is why we think alchemy is all about this changing of gold. And the role of the Hathor, of the cow goddess Hathor, may shed some light on what was going on. And this is when the story gets really quite interesting, because she had many roles, mostly to do with nurturing. She sometimes lent her cow horns to the goddess Isis when Isis was tending the infant Horus. Hathor was particularly the one who nurtures the soul of the pharaoh on his journey. And furthermore, another of her names is Nubta, N-U-B-T, which is the word for gold. And her connection with gold is obvious at her temple at Dendera on the Nile, which has the hieroglyph for gold on its back wall. And it's in the Dendera temple where there are these strange light bulb, I don't know if you can all see that, reliefs in the crypt. And you can read about the electrical processes in my book if you want. And even more significantly, it's in her temple at Serabit el-Khadim, which I forced Hugh to go and look at, I hope, in the Sinai, which is even more extraordinary, because it's here in the Sinai at the Serabit el-Khadim when the 19th century Flinders Petrie found white powder, which when tested had no animal ash in it, and they weren't able to establish then what the white powder was. And there were vast quantities of it hidden under slabs in the floor. So was this powder that Flinders Petrie discovered? Was this the philosopher's stone? And what was it that the pharaoh thought he was doing when he was consuming it? To answer that question, it's important to know something about the Egyptian attitude towards spirit bodies and the soul. They had an entirely different meaning of the word soul from us. And we are only now relearning about the soul from the Far East and India, and we've become aware that the soul could have different layers, such as an aura. To the Egyptians, that would have been entirely familiar. For them, the soul was a complex entity. It was not just a question of being dead, alive, or judged. It was composed of many layers, etheric bodies, with three main components: the ab, which I've highlighted down there, the ka, which is the hands above the head, and the ba, the little bird. The ka was the layer of the soul that corresponded to what we might regard as the aura. It was the vehicle transmitting vitality between spiritual and material bodies, and was thus considered immortal. Strictly speaking, what we call the soul for the Egyptians was the ba, the little bird. And this aspect of the soul was the astral body. It was why it needed the ka in order to inhabit the body. The ba could leave the body while it was still alive, and for example, while the body was asleep. That's why you sometimes had strange dreams, because your ba has gone off to other places. The second shrine of Tutankhamun shows the pharaoh connected with a star and his ba sitting on a perch in front of him. And what the pharaoh was attempting to do during his shamanic ritual was to unite these different aspects of his soul, his ka and his ba, while he was still alive, to become an ark, a shining light. A picture I've put over there, the heron, which is sometimes referred to as the phoenix, in which form he could communicate with his ancestor spirits. All these aspects of the soul were eternal, and an illustration of this concept is to be found in the Egyptian Hall of Judgment. This particular description was on the walls of a 3rd century BC temple dedicated to goddess Mart, built by Ptolemies, by Greek pharaohs in fact. Here the heart soul is in the weighing scales, and it's weighed against the feather of truth, which is the thing in the other scale, with Osiris sitting in judgment. And depending on whether or not the heart weighs successfully, whether you've told the truth in your life, because it's about your integrity, depends on whether Osiris would either send you to join the spirits in eternity, or consumed by the part hippopotamus, part crocodile monster, who devoured the souls of the dead in order to send them back into reincarnation. I mean, that's the punishment, is being reincarnated. We in the West, unfortunately, are denied the possibility of belief in death as part of the cycle because of our Christian brainwashing. So for us, death is a hopeless experience, implying permanent separation. And as a result, survivors of traumatic events often feel terribly guilty and feel that life is pointless. They might feel differently if they could believe that although the flesh dies, the soul lives on, is liable to reincarnation in another body. Above all, in the old religion, death was understood as part of this cycle. In the words of the Hermetica, everything on earth must be destroyed, for without destruction, nothing can be created. The new comes out of the old. Every birth of living flesh, like every growth of crop from seed, will be followed by destruction. But from decay comes renewal. The reason I've gone into such detail is I want to try and convey the deeply spiritual nature of the Egyptians' approach to civilization. It was about more than straight roads and sanitation. We are still living with the consequences of the decision of the Emperor Constantine to adopt Christianity in the 4th century AD. And it matters because what happened in the 4th century affected our understanding of the truth. Fundamentally, Christianity, under the influence of the Romans, altered the philosophical basis for civilization in the West by substituting the complex pantheism of the old beliefs for the simpler hierarchy of the Holy Trinity, with an all-powerful God the Father figure at the head of it. The Church effectively unbundled and disengaged the holistic nature of ancient religions that had been central to civilization. In the old religion, there was no attempt to use a superior deity to monopolize truth. In Egypt, every temple had its own special deity, and so no single temple could dominate the country or its religion. But what Christians misunderstood was that pantheism explained the world by allocating specific attributes or principles to different deities and forces within nature. Egypt was, of course, the example par excellence of this practice. Egyptian pantheism wasn't necessarily superstitious. It was just easier to understand different aspects of one god if they're distributed in this way. So it constitutes a many-layered understanding of the world, both profane and profound. And it's only now that we are rediscovering that with people like James Lovelock and his Gaia concept and that kind of thing. Even in the 2nd century AD, a Greek commentator called Celsus, he understood this point. He knew that the religion of Egypt transcended the worship of irrational beasts. Those are his words. He realized that animals were symbols of invisibilities and not objects of worship in themselves. Because what the Bronze Age civilizers knew is they knew that the divine manifests itself in all forms of energy, that the planet is an expression of nature spirits that exist in 4 elements, and we can feel these elements, that spirit energy is deep in the mineral kingdom, inside the earth, and that this energy manifests itself in crystals, gold, silver, metals, and that it has electromagnetic properties. The ancients knew that this energy manifests itself through the plant kingdom. And these are this is wild barley, and that's wild carrot over there. They knew that these plant energies were important to us. And they also knew that the animal kingdom, and these 2 pictures at the bottom are genetically reconstructed wild auroch and wild tarpan. Somebody has gone to all the trouble to kind of work backwards with the genetics to produce a wild auroch and a wild tarpan, which is just extraordinary. And the point is about the ancients is that they knew that wild animals come from a pure source unaffected by humans, which we are privileged to witness, that they have souls too. But modern man can no longer live in a state of grace with wild kingdoms of nature. There's not enough wilderness left on the planet. We have no choice but to organise ourselves in civilised society, in cities supplied by systematic farming. But what is lacking from modern society is an understanding and a connection to eternal spirit that exists at all these different levels. We think that we are all that there is, and the only thing that matters is ourselves. We forget to honour the divine. For us to survive, we must relearn how to manifest through this energy. And every aspect of modern society needs to reflect that in our cities and in our countryside. We're too easily distracted by modern materialism. Because the Bronze Age civilizers knew all of that. And so they were able to use these earth energies, using sacred geometry, using geodesy, So that to create networks and how everything, to use that energy that flows around the earth, to create spiritually sensitive urban spaces. And they use gold and semi-precious stones and crystals. And I have yet, for example, to understand the real purpose of lapis lazuli, but I was fascinated at the recent British Museum exhibition on the treasures of Afghanistan, from where all lapis lazuli comes, to find that pieces of lapis lazuli were excavated in the earliest Mesopotamian. So obviously it had some very important property for them. And they also deliberately genetically modified plants for convenient harvesting. So they're trapping these energies. They knew what to do and they trapped them. And in the same way with animals too, domesticated animals that link us closely to these mineral and plant kingdoms. They are as food providers and workers and as spiritual companions. I put in this picture of an obelisk. I don't really know quite why, but something to do with electromagnetic probably. Anyway, their goal was to live in comfort and harmony, in mart, in truth. And that's what they wanted to do. And I think that, in a way, that's what we need to reconsider. We live off the earth and not of the earth, but we can reconnect if we choose. And I leave you with this quote from my favourite Roman, an exception to the rule, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, Marcus Aurelius. And he says, constantly regard the universe as one living being, having one substance and one soul, and observe how all things have reference to one perception, the one perception of this living being, and how all things act with one movement, and how all things are cooperating causes of all things which exist. Observe too the continuous spinning of the thread and the contexture of the web. And thank you all very much for listening to me. You can read more about what I've talked about in my book. And I hope that I've maybe give you some ideas about how we can reconnect with the ancient archetype. My book in particular takes it all, what happened to this archetype from the end of the Ice Age up through the Knights Templars, Hermeticists, alchemists of the Renaissance to the modern day. So thank you all very much. Does anyone have any questions? Of course.
It's a lot harder
Yeah.
than questioning catastrophe.
I know what you mean. I mean, in fact, I should say that in my book, I've been as careful as I can be. Everything is based on archaeologists' evidence. You know, I don't kind of channel. I don't write about anything. I don't write about Atlantis or anything that you can't actually say there's evidence for this. What I'm doing is I'm saying my interpretation is different. So I'm putting a different twist on it. But I mean, this is for today.
The catastrophes might sound well in this audience,
Yeah.
but I think in other audiences, and that's the audience that needs to be
I do change the talk a bit, but thanks. Anybody else got anything they want to add? Well, anyway, thank you all very much.